All right. Time for our final talk of the day, everybody. Today's speaker is going to be Marcin. He's from Figma, but you might know from his Twitter that his true passion is tech museums. He likes looking at old technology, particularly keyboards. Now, he's not technically talking about keyboards today, but he still couldn't resist putting a key command into the top of there. So without further ado, I'm going to let him explain exactly what happens when you press Command B. Come on up, Marcin.
In 2019, one of the Figma users filed this bug. And basically said, my command B works sometimes it bolds the fonts and sometimes it doesn't. And it seems particularly it works for Roboto and doesn't work for Chalkboard, right? So in effect, what the user is saying, I can do this and it works. If we could add the sound, that would be perfect. And so this bolts, thank you, as expected, very important. This doesn't. Very interesting bug, right? And I started looking at this bug because I like bugs actually a lot and I like investigating them. And of course, my first thought was, why using Chalkboard? But this actually ended up being a very interesting thing that ended up teaching me a lot. And I wanted to walk you through a little bit of why this was such a fascinating bug. So fonts are actually pretty complicated. And even the very definition of bold gets very complicated the more you start looking at it. So, originally, a long time ago, a lot of fonts just came with regular and bold. And, there was italic there somewhere. Some of them started adding light. But these days, a lot of modern fonts basically have a lot of weights under light and a lot of weights above bold. And, they usually look something like this in the UI, but I deliberately actually did not list them because I was actually curious, and we're going to do this together. I'm actually curious how many people remember what they are in which order. So we're going to do a little bit of a room thing. So, I have a series of questions, and each one is basically which one is thinner. So, we're going to raise our hands, and who thinks extra light is thinner than thin? Raise your hand, please. All right. Who thinks thin is thinner than extra light? Perfect. Most fonts, that's exactly right. Thin is first. All right. Question number 2. Which one is thinner? All right. So who thinks it's semi-bold? Who thinks semi-bold is thinner? Okay. All right. I see a handful of hands. Who thinks demi-bold is thinner than semi-bold? Interesting. They're supposed to be exactly the same. It's just the difference between those two names. Some fonts just choose demi-bold, some fonts just choose semi-bold. Okay, which one is thinner, book or regular? Okay, who thinks book is thinner? Please raise your hand. All right, I see some people. Who thinks regular is thinner? All right, thank you so much. The answer is nobody knows. Literally nobody knows. All of these names are sort of, they seem to be an agreement, if you will, but very closely when you start looking, things just fall apart completely. So sometimes light is called demi in book, and sometimes normal is called book or regular, and black is called heavy, and in some really, really bad fonts, it's actually called fat. Extra bold is called ultra bold, thin is called hairline, extra light is called ultra light, and semi-bold is sometimes called demi-bold, and I'm not even counting all of the different ways they are spelled. It's an agreement, so nothing prevents a font from doing something like this. It's just a list of names, right? And of course, we've actually been there before. So I don't know how many of you know this, that long time ago, font sizes actually used to be names. So this is about 150 something years ago. Those are actually font prices, if you're interested. And those are names. So Pika is smaller and Diamond is bigger. And it's actually funny, right? Like there was a time where somebody thought, what if there were numbers? And there were all of these conversion charts. But imagine that, Figma today could still look something like this, where you had to know whether, Excelsior is smaller than Brevier and where is Nonpareil in all of this, right? And fortunately, we have this today. And the same thing happens with font weights, right? So instead of this, we can actually start just using those kind of numbers, and they're specified in CSS and elsewhere. But of course, it also gets complicated. So imagine you have all of this weight in your font, and you want to make this bold by pressing Command B. So this is relatively simple, right? It's a pretty well-known thing that 400 is normal and 700 is bold. So you can just do this, right? And even if some weights are missing, it doesn't really change anything. Even if you only have 700, it's perfect, right? You can just make it bold and go back. What if you have 400 and 800? Should we go there or not, right? And I think the idea is that like 800 is pretty close to 700, so why not, right? What if your font only has 400 and 600? Is that good enough? And at Figma, we decided, yes, it's not gonna get super bold, as you will see, but it still gets you something. What if it's 900? And we thought it's a little bit too far, right? It would be kind of disturbing if you press Command B and something goes really, really black, so nothing happens. And there's interesting dilemmas like, which one do you choose here? And we decided we're gonna go for 800 because you probably kind of want something bolder, and the same the other way around. And what's really interesting thing that bothers people if it doesn't work is that if you press Command B and press it back and it doesn't come back, right? There's this sort of agreement that it has to be reversible. Right, so we also have to think about that. And of course, now it gets more complicated because what if you have a different width? Not a problem here because you can jump to bold and back. What do we do here? Is bold more important than the width? And in use Figma, this will actually happen. And you can tell me if it feels great or really bad because it does change the width. But one thing that won't happen, we never go italic because it's super weird when you press Command V and you get italic in addition to weight. And then there's this other thing, which is, if you look at this, you might ask, why don't you just like make it bold, right? Isn't bold just thicker, right? And of course, some of you who know typography know that this is not really the case. This is a font called Surveyor Text and some letter forms. And if you go bold, the letter forms actually change pretty drastically. It's not just wider or a little thicker to the side. If you overlay them, you can see that it's a pretty significant change. And each type designer has to make those changes by hand. If you look at the digit 7 in Surveyor Text, you can see that it becoming bold is actually a pretty interesting change. If you were just to take 7 and make it thicker in a very naive way, you almost end up with exact opposite of what you wanted. And typography has a name for this, that those kind of fake bolding is called faux, and generally, it's frowned upon, right? We're not doing this. This is pretty gross, actually, that's 7. I can't even look at it. Look at this, right? The fake bold looks so much worse than real bold, and it extends to other things. Small caps are not just smaller letters. They're actually drawn in direct proportion to the actual letters, so they feel good. And the same with superscript and subscript. They are not just smaller digits. They're actually kind of using the same visual vocabulary. And then there's this other thing when you use Figma, which gets really complicated, which is fonts come from different places. So you might have your fonts that came with your Mac OS or Windows. You might have installed some fonts yourself. Figma comes with over 1,000 Google fonts, so that's that. And maybe there's even some few fonts that we add in outside of Google Fonts. And, that seems pretty straightforward, right? You have a long list of fonts. But of course, in reality, this is what it looks like. You could have a font that also exists as a Google font, or you could have a macOS font that you decided to install on your own because it's a different version. And we have to reconcile this, and it looks different for different people. Somebody who's really into fonts, that's going to look like this. Somebody on a Chromebook, it's going to look like this. And then we have to resolve all of this. And then there's multiplayer, the feature of Figma that I think a lot of people like, but it just makes my life really difficult. Because imagine you, capital D designer, you just bought like the newest version of Helvetica. It's gorgeous, right? It's just like the best Helvetica that's ever been made. You install it on your computer, you open Figma, Figma picks it up, you start designing, it's great. You give your file to somebody else. And they also have Helvetica. Except their Helvetica just sort of fell off the back of a truck in 1997. And, Figma just says it's the same thing. But what can happen, and this is actually real, is that you can grab this and press B, Command B, and the metrics don't match. Or can happen, you press Command B, and there's no letter that matches. It's probably not going to be Y, right, to be fair, but it does happen. And so at Figma, we designed this thing called shared fonts, where if you're an organization, you can just install a font for everybody magically. And it's supposed to be great. Like you have this UI, you just upload fonts if you have a good license, and we're good, except this is now becoming this. So we have another silo of fonts that can overlap other silos, and it gets tricky. Imagine you have a Google font that's, has 3 weights. And then you install a shared font that's the same font, but it has 2 weights, and they're different. What should Figma do, right? And sort of the obvious answer is it should just merge them, right? But you will start seeing that maybe the metrics don't match, and maybe things like this will happen. Just showed you. So Figma actually decides you know what you're doing, so you just own this font from now on, and we're just gonna just choose the whatever, right? It's very hard to explain to people why we do this, and we get some complaints about that. And there's all sorts of other things like this. Like, for example, one person uses Windows, one person uses a Chromebook. Which emoji should we use? Is it that one, the platform one? Is it sort of the gold standard? I guess it's Apple emoji, or some sort of arbitrary, I don't actually have answers for all of these questions. And then there's the hardest thing. So fonts supposed to come with all sorts of metadata that tell you all about them, tell you what they're capable of, what are the measurements, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, this data is often of very poor quality. Sometimes it's for historical reasons. For example, fonts actually have 3 different sets of vertical metrics, and they're supposed to be in agreement, but sometimes they're not. And we have to choose one. And then there's another thing, it's localization. So at some point, I started thinking about what if Figma could tell you which fonts support which languages. So this is a Polish pangram. And you kind of want to use a font that supports Polish fully, because otherwise this happens. So I started coming up with heuristics about how to determine whether a font supports Polish or not. And fonts are supposed to tell you. So they have all of this metadata that has lists of things, and you should be able to just ask them. Unfortunately, the data is not the best quality. And I tested a lot of fonts. And I actually have a question for you. What do you think is a number? Because it's not 100%, right? Is it only 80% fonts that fully trustworthy tell you which locality support, or is the quality even lower? 60%, right? What do you think it is? So let's do the room thing. It's actually 0%. It's so bad. Fonts, you cannot ask a font which language it supports, right? You actually just have to see all the symbols one by one and figure it out yourself. At Figma, we also decided to move the font styles a little bit, because we think that italics are actually not as popular and important in UI design. So we demoted them to be at the bottom of the list, which I think is a better call. But, you tell me, actually, I'm very curious what you think about it. It puts italic at the bottom, and also it makes it easier to see the relationship between different weights. But of course, now it puts pressure on Figma to understand whether a font is actually italic or not. And it gets tricky. This is SF Mono a few years ago. It has an italic angle of 180 degrees. I have no idea what this is supposed to mean. What it meant for users was that this happened. Every version of SF Mono was italic, except for some reason heavy. We actually had to special case it in our code just for SF Mono, right? And some fonts tell you they're italic in one place, and then tell you they're not italic in the other place. And we have to do something. So we have this clause that if a font name has italic somewhere as a substring, we're going to say it's italic even if it claims it's not. But then we're back to this. We're back to this thing that we try to avoid, which is looking at strings and comparing them to a bunch of other strings, which is horrible, right? And, well, okay, I'm not going to complain all that much, because actually variable fonts fix this, right? So the issue with it, I'm sorry, this doesn't sound right. Let me just check my notes. Oh no, it's actually the exact opposite. Variable fonts made it awful, right? This is just 10 fonts that I queried, and it's 6 different ways that express italic. Some of them are slant, it's just a mess, right? So this is what we have to deal with, right? All of this happens all the time. But at least now you're where I am, right? We all know what the challenges are, and we can go back to trying to solve this bug that this user has about pressing Command B. There's nothing else to figure out. They want absolutely, oh shit. Then there's keyboards, right? Command B is a keyboard shortcut, and we have to also talk about that. And you can think of keyboards as probably, not a new invention, right? Not a new, like not an old invention. I mean, typography is super old, hundreds of years, right? But actually, so are keyboards. Right? Keyboards are incredibly old. And you might say, like, wait, this is a music keyboard, right? It doesn't count. It's a different kind of a keyboard. But actually, very early typewriters were based on music keyboards. This is actually Miscela. It's used in Italy, actually up to this day for chord stenography. It looks a little bit more modern, but they still use that kind of musical typing. After a while, we kind of figure out that it's actually buttons that are more useful than the sort of music chording keys. And sort of keyboards move to that way, but they're still called keyboards. They're still called keys, right? Strangely enough. You might look at the very early QWERTY keyboard from almost 150 years ago, and it's strange how similar it looks to keyboards of today, right? Maybe that's a path dependence in there somewhere. But everything that was attached to those keyboards changed drastically, right? So we still have a lot of interesting challenges that happened in those last 150 years. And the funny thing is that if you take a Dutch keyboard, it's actually relatively simple, right? It looks very much like a regular English, US English QWERTY keyboard. There were some exceptions throughout time. This is a very interesting typewriter that had an I, like the Dutch I, which I think is very cool, instead of Y, and the Y was sort of demoted. There were also some typewriters that had what I call the most Dutch key ever. How many of you can already see it? What is the most? Here we go. Yeah, it's this a Florian I key, which I think is very cute. That's how you can tell a typewriter is Dutch. Nothing else. Otherwise, it looks pretty standard, right? But it's still kind of strange what happens with keyboards today. I have a question for you, and this is actually a real question. I'm not going to trick you. What do you expect to be printed when you press Shift-2? Right? And yeah, let's do this. Let's do it like raise your hand. How many people expect the @ key or the @ symbol? Okay, how many people expect a quotation mark? Thank you. It's not 50, it's not 0, it's 100, it's somewhere in between, right? And it gets tricky just for the shortcut alone, right? It's something we have to think about. And actually, I have a story about Shift-2, and I think it's an interesting story. And it also starts as a bug that somebody reported to Figma. I have a problem with using Shift-2 to zoom. It works when I use the main keys, but it doesn't work with the numeric key. Basically, Figma has this shortcut. When you press Shift-2, it zooms in on the current selection, which is, I think, sometimes very, very useful. That person said, it worked when I did this. It didn't work when I did this. Just fix this, please. And we started looking at this. And what was really interesting was it only manifested itself on Windows, not on a Mac, for some reason. And I started looking at this, and it's actually a story that starts in 1977. In 1977, most computers looked like this, but the preeminent computer manufacturer, IBM, wanted to make a smaller computer, smaller in quotation mark. It was called IBM 5251. It wasn't very popular, but it came with this keyboard. It's a very 70s keyboard. It has numeric keypad on the right, alphanumeric in the middle, and some keys on the left, including arrow keys, which were really not that useful back in the day. Computer didn't really go very far. A few years later, IBM came up with 5322, really great with names, by the way. It was more portable, although I think this person is not really having that much fun. They reused the same keyboard from 251, except, they sort of updated its styling to be more 80s, right? And some of you might recognize this kind of a styling. It's exactly the same thing, right? Numeric keypad, alphanumeric, some functions on the left. Computer didn't really go anywhere. So in 1981, IBM tried again, releasing IBM 5150. It had the same keyboard, But now they changed some things around. They wanted to have function keys on the left, so they went from F1 to F10, and the arrow keys were becoming more and more popular. But there were already a numeric keypad on the right. So somebody decided, oh, let's just do both, right? Let's have numeric keypad. If you want it, you can press numlock. Then you have arrow keys. You can press numlock. You have numeric keypad. Problem solved, right? Except it's really not that fun to do it when you use a spreadsheet, which was the most important application of that time. Because you have to like press a number, you press numlock, you use the arrow keys, you press numlock again. The numlock doesn't have a light yet, so it's very, very annoying. So somebody had this interesting thought. That somebody, by the way, just happens to be the person who also invented Control-Alt-Delete. We're not going to talk about it, but I thought it was really, really fun thing. They said, you know how like if you type uppercase and lowercase, you don't just keep pressing caps lock, right? We solved this problem. You have shift for the other hand that is not typing currently. So what if we do that here, right? You have numeric keypad. When you use your right hand, you can hold shift with your left hand to reverse it, right? So now you hold shift and it becomes arrow keys or all of these navigation things. So you press 2, you get a digit 2. You press shift 2, you get a down arrow. And some of you are already knowing what's happening here. So they solved it, right? Some people really like this solution and it worked. Eventually, IBM released IBM 8525 5 years later, and it came with this proper keyboard. It's actually one of the best keyboards some people would claim ever made. It had a separate arrow keys. It had a separate numeric keypad. So they sort of undid that damage, right? I need that sort of conflation, except in the world of keyboards, you can't really undo anything. Because once something installs itself in your modern memory, it's impossible to get it out there, and you're very angry. So since so many people got used to the numlock and so many people got used to the shift shortcut, they had to keep it. So now they have arrow keys on the left, arrow keys on the right, and a numeric keypad, and it's just a mess. And we all still have that today. And that's exactly what was happening back in 1981 and back in 1986. And then it traveled with us through Windows 1, Windows 2, Windows 3, Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows 2000, Windows XP. We don't talk about this one, Windows 8 and Windows 10, and arrived at this desk of this computer in 2019. And you know what happened? They tried to press Shift 2. Somewhere before Figma even got to the shortcut, the operating system was like, oh, we know what you want. You love this thing we did in 1981, right? Not a bug in theory, right? Like, is this a bug? It's a shortcut and nobody knows, but it comes with this history. We did not fix it. We could. Tell me what we should do, because sometimes I honestly don't know what to do in those kind of situations. And by the way, this is why it was only Windows. Mac never had this problem. Mac never put together two things on one set of keys. They never had to invent numlock. It only manifested itself on Windows. And while we're here, we talked about Shift 2, why not talk about something very similar? So I'm gonna ask you a question. What is the sequence of keys or a key that you use to take a screenshot if you do? Right? So if you do it very often, it might actually be hard to remember. The trick is you try to replicate it with your fingers and you look at your fingers. The modern memory is separate for regular memory. That's like the beauty of typing and a curse. Okay, so we're gonna, at the count of 3, each one of you shouts out the shortcut that you use to take screenshots. All right? On the count of 3. 1, 2. Exactly. I think you're picking up what I'm putting down. So, yeah, some people use print screen or some combination of print screen on Windows. That's the easier part. But let's talk about the Mac, because it actually gets really interesting, right? So we're gonna do it one by one, because there are many shortcuts, and let's do it together. So what is the most obvious take a screenshot, put it on a desktop shortcut? Can somebody shout it out? Oh no, on a Mac. Command-Shift-3, that's the one, all right? So we got that. Okay, take a screenshot of a part of the screen. Command-Shift-4, exactly, all right? Take a screenshot of a specific window. Yes, Command-Shift-4 space, incredibly intuitive, by the way. We're gonna go further than this. All right, take a screenshot, but put it in a clipboard rather than on your desktop. Command-Shift-Control-4. You might have to borrow somebody else's finger, but it's there. Take a screenshot of a specific window without the shadow. Yeah, well, I had different stories. Command-Shift-4, and then you press Option-Space, because of course you do. Take a screenshot of the same part of the screen as you did last time. I'm messing with you. That actually doesn't exist. I wish it did. I wish it would save so much trouble. All right. Take a video recording. Command-Shift-5, yes. And I swear to God, this is not a joke. I know, too soon, but take a screenshot of the touch bar. Yes. I mean, who takes screenshots of your touch bar? That exists. So we went through a bunch of things. There are probably more. Actually, I'm not sure these are all of them. And they're sort of all versions of 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you might start very quickly ask the question, wait, why is it 3? Why is it not starting with 1? And it's kind of a strange story about this. So the original Mac actually used 1 or 2. And it used it to eject the floppy. You could drag it to a trash can, you could use the menu. But if you're a power user, the whole thing with Command-Shift was like a system of different kind of nerdy shortcuts that really, really experienced people would use. Well, you might ask, where's 2? You could buy a second floppy drive, right? So none of this is relevant anymore. But of course, we have to keep Command-Shift-3 and Command-Shift-4 today, and the rest is free to use. Extra, and I would be really impressed that if somebody knows this, but maybe somebody does. How do you take a screenshot and put it on your image writer from 1984? I actually had no idea this even existed. You press caps lock before, right? Because this wasn't complicated enough. It's basically all of the keys possible at this point. So, it all sort of starts feeling like this very quickly. And I also want to harken back to since we're in the neighborhood of the keyboard, let's just talk about Shift-1 very quickly. Doesn't seem very contentious, right? Like Shift-1 is an exclamation point. Except if you look at this keyboard, something's kind of missing. 1, and actually something even more on the other side. Yeah, they did a lot of cost cutting, right? It was typewriters were really, really expensive early on, so they just tried to save as many keys as possible. So the 1 and 0 were not available, but what if you wanted to type 1 or 0? Well, there was a hack. So if you want to press 0, you have capital O, right? If you want to press 1, you have lowercase l. They were actually kind of designed, to look sort of like both at the same time, which every typography in the room is like, just save me, please, this is the worst. But they did it, like, 0 and 1. So, you could type a number, you could just type, love, and it all sort of supposed to felt very natural, right? But the funny thing that happened for us at Figma was that this became kind of relevant. So some of you have probably seen this menu if you use Figma, and it has all of these sort of shortcuts for moving around and zooming. And, they seem pretty straightforward. But you might ask, wait, why are we showing them like this rather than like this? Right? This is sort of more appropriate way, like it is an exclamation point, it is an @ sign, well, except if it's a quotation mark. And the reason is that we want to help people understand the system of the shortcuts, right? We want to help people understand that the 0, 1, and 2 are related. It doesn't really matter what they output because they're sort of command shortcuts, right? They're not typing shortcuts. And Command plus, it's the nice opposite of minus, even though you don't have to hold Shift, right? So it's stuff like that that really starts mattering a lot. We have other things like this all the time. We have all of the shortcuts, for example, to fine-tune details of typography, which is really cool. If you put them again in your modern memory, you can move really, really fast and fine-tune things very, very quickly. But again, why are we not showing them like this or like this? And each one of this is the right answer, and also each one of them is the wrong answer, right? Like, why is Shift included? Why is it not included? And even that set of shortcut has even more problems. And I don't know how many of you already picked up the third line, adjust letter spacing, option, angle bracket, option, angle bracket. Here's what happened on a Mac, if you happen to use a Mac. Mac has this sort of like secret typographical layer that you can access by holding option. So if you hold option, you can just press anywhere, you can press a letter, and you get one of those predefined, Unicode code points. And some of us really love them. I love the sort of option 7 for Pilcrow because I sort of use it all the time. Some people love other ones. But option angle brackets are actually outputting less than and bigger than. And we made this call to say, those are not as important. If you press this at Figma, we're just going to increase or decrease letter spacing because we thought the whole system of the shortcuts is more important than this one use case. And I stand by it, although some people actually complain about this because it's really annoying if you use this and in Figma you have to copy and paste those symbols from elsewhere. But the really annoying part happens to be the German keyboard because, of course, there are different per language. So in Germany, the same shortcut actually outputs an ellipsis. And that's universally beloved by designers. Like everybody just loves pressing like having a nice ellipsis. And so we actually had to change those shortcuts in Germany just to save that ellipsis. And that's sort of what it is like all the time with those things. So those are only some considerations of the keyboard shortcuts that we have. And now that we understand the complex world of typography and the complex world of sort of keyboard shortcuts and history, now we can attempt to unwind this thing. And I kind of hate that we do, right? Or at least that I do, because I used to be able to just like look at a nice typewriter like this one and look at its keyboard and be like, oh, this is just gorgeous. I love this thing. I love this Olivetti Praxis 48. It's like, look at those keys, right? No, my life is stuff like this. Every shortcut we add to Figma, somebody really, really dislikes. And that's okay. I mean, I wouldn't use some of those words, but it's okay. I'm not picking on that person. Those things can be incredibly frustrating. What's even harder, if I actually don't know if somebody likes it or not. And we get this kind of feedback, which is just like, can you just tell me if we're good or not? Because this is, I don't know if it's a joke or something, right? So there's all of this ambiguous feedback, and it just gets complicated. Like my world of keyboards is all the time stuff like this. On the way here at the airport, I managed to lock myself out of my computer by typing what I thought was my password over and over again. How many of you know what happened? And you can actually see it in a screenshot. My keyboard switched itself to Hungarian for some reason. I don't know why. I typed all this shit. I realized it's, I think 2 more failed attempts and we locked out for days, and I don't know how to present this presentation, right? So this is keyboards, and fonts are exactly the same. Those are my Figma files all the time. It's just testing fonts, like bugs and Asana tickets. And again, I used to be able to just like go to surveyor text and select it. And look how good this looks. I could just do it all day. Look at this 7. But I don't. I can't do this the whole day. This is what I have to do the whole day. This is the kind of stuff that I have to deal with. And we actually have a room in our office. It's called Be Bold. Nothing to do with typography. Still feels kind of personal. And so putting all of this aside, I've been noticing that my command Be Bold key is behaving differently than before. It works on Roboto, doesn't work on Chalkboard. And so our support team start investigating. There's some basic questions around fonts. There are basic questions about keyboards, and there are basic questions in general, and we start there. I'm using the desktop of our website. We run a Mac or a PC because obviously everything's different. We're sorry to ask, It actually helps. Can you just restart everything? Okay, it doesn't help. All right. Let's talk about fonts. Do you use shared fonts? Do you have a font manager? Do you have local versions of, oh, you do have a local version. Can you send them to us so we can see if they look, okay, they look kind of okay. So it's not a problem. Okay, let's talk about keyboards. Do you have an external keyboard? Do you have any custom keyboard shortcuts? No. It is like, what language is your keyboard, by the way? Do you use like any non-QWERTY layouts? Do you, any apps that might change? No. Scraping the bottom of the barrel here. Any programs you have in the background. And please restart everything just in case it helps. We're weeks into talking at this point, right? And we get nothing. All of the things that I told you, nothing. And then we get this. Oh yeah, so all of these things I talked about, nothing. And then we get this. This doesn't happen very often, but the user comes back to us and says, I solved the mystery. I actually know what happened. And some of you might already know this because the clues are in the first message. They've been there all along. Used to work January 2019. I solved the mystery. It's my MacBook keyboard. This MacBook keyboard with the touch bar, new switches. It's so disappointing, right? It's so disappointing. All of what we talked about today, the first computer that had both was Xerox Alto in 1973. The first computer that I know of that had Control B to make something bold, and the first computer that could actually show you the bold. 73. That's a long time ago. And you would think that we got it all covered. And yet, we don't, because sometimes there's some stuff that just breaks and we cannot foresee it. And I think that's just like, that can feel incredibly hard sometimes. But the last part, I wanted to tell you a little bit about like how I'm trying to cope with this, because I actually saw people burn out on stuff like this in my work. How many of you know this quote? If you can understand a city, that city is dead. I like that sentiment a lot. And I've actually investigated a little bit where we are today. And I apologize if all of you know this already, but it was exciting for me to get to know where we're talking and some of the stories of that part of the city. Any of you know, for example, why, if you look up this church, why you always see pictures sort of from the west, from the east or from the south, but never from the other side? Because other side kind of looks like this, but there's a reason for it. The reason was that a few decades ago, Amsterdam wanted to build an east line of the metro. And they decided to do it in a pretty bad way, which is destroy every building in its path so you could just sunken a thing rather than, dig or drill without interrupting anybody above. You can see the church actually right here. This is where we are. The church was saved, but a lot of the buildings were not. It was actually a huge deal, from what I understand, in Amsterdam. It was a lot of protests around that. And eventually, Amsterdam stopped doing things like this. But, the scar of that moment in time is still there. And if you know where to look for it, you can see it very easily. There's another question I started asking. Why is it called the South Church? From what I understand, that's the name, right? And if you go back centuries, that church was actually in the south part of the city, right? Right now, obviously, it's all central because Amsterdam grew so much in the intervening centuries. But back then, this was a south church. So actually, I think all of the churches had different directions, and there was an old church and a new church. So that's kind of, this used to be south of Amsterdam and hasn't been for a long time. And there's also the one thing that I really liked and probably very well known. There's a West Street, I think Westerstraat. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it poorly. And it has this sort of regular numbers of buildings. And they go from 78, 76, 74, 72, 70, and then it's 54 and 52. You can go there right now if you, in 6.5 minutes. The reason, it was really cool, the reason is that there used to be buildings in the back between those two buildings. and they got all of the missing numbers. It doesn't happen anymore, but of course, the numbers couldn't change easily. And the funny thing is that somebody actually tried to celebrate it. So if you look very closely, in between building 70 and 54, somebody put those missing buildings there. Which I think is really cool, and it's sort of celebration of those things that otherwise are just a completely arbitrary annoying, right? This is a bug in numbering of buildings if you look at it in a certain way, but it's not. If you can understand a city, that city is dead. If you can understand typography fully, it means the typography won't ever change. If you can understand keyboards, the keyboards will never get better. That's kind of how I look at it sometimes. And I want to do one thing that I've never done before, and I hope maybe you enjoy me trying, because I'm almost certainly going to fail to some extent. But we have about a minute, which makes perfect sense to walk you through the history of modifier keys, right? I talked about Command B, but then I mentioned Control B. And some people actually, when I talked about this talk, they were like, wait, what is Command B? I'm on Windows, right? What are you talking about? So it started as a Control B, and there's this whole history of modifier keys that I want to tell you a little bit about. And we're going to have to move pretty fast. So we're going to do a modifier key speed run. And, if anything strikes your interest, talk to me later. All right. It started with uppercase. Some typewriters use fixed options, but sometimes also use fixed figures and punctuation. Also in patterns, there were words like push, move, slide, draw, swing, and oscillate. But eventually we arrived at shift key, except some typewriters started branding it. So it was floating shift, and it was shift freedom and power shift, like power windows and power steering in your car. Eventually, since this was just one key, you could go label-less. But of course, there were more modifier keys on the way. So there was keyboard release, there was control, there was alternate coding that eventually became alt, and there was a keyboard called space-coded keyboard that some of you might know now, that added a few top, meta, Greek, super, hyper, and also front, if you can look very carefully. And then word processor added code, except those that used extra. And then we had all of this key from modern microcomputers, which was Commodore, Atari, Amiga. Some of them have graphic symbols, and they use a graph modifier key, but some of them had too many, so they have to do left graph and right graph. And then ZX Spectrum added symbol, shift, and caps. Some other computers use caps, and then some other computers compose to put some characters together. And of course, Apple had closed Apple and open Apple, and oh shit, I forgot, Amiga also had open Amiga. And then we had use front on a Canon CAD, which is an amazing computer, and a leap key also on Canon CAD. If you're so interested, I can tell you all about this. And then Apple Lisa and Apple Macintosh introduced option. And then they use command, which of course happened before on other computers, but we don't talk about it. And Apple couldn't decide what to call it because it is an Apple key and an Apple key. So other people started calling it something else, like Splat, Cloverleaf, Pretzel, and Propeller. And then Apple came to their senses and they started calling it command. Thank you. And so then Apple started adding control, and then some computers started using function. Then we had alt graphic for alternate graphics. Of course, Windows and Windows menu came on board. There was some keyboard that used cold key, some strange stuff like shortcut and macro. This is a Russian keyboard. Then Chromebook started using a search key, launcher key, and an assistant key that some people that have trypophobia really, really hate. And then there were fun keys, and some artisanal keys had a function too because they were too small. And then Microsoft started adding emoji keys, but they couldn't decide what it looks like. And Apple started messing with function keys. And if you use an artisanal keyboard, sometimes the modifier keys look like a butterfly or a planet or whatever you want. I swear to God, okay, this is over 70 keys that I could think of, and I didn't think that hard. That's a new modifier key every 2 years, which heartbreaking for me, maybe fun for you. It's heartbreaking for me because even though we had all of these modifiers, we constantly ran out of modifier keys at Figma. But that's a whole different story. This is also, by the way, why Logitech keyboards look like this, because they just have to cover all of the bases, and that's why you have menu options like this. Because, by the way, when I locked myself out of my computer, this was also the state I left my computer in, which was not very smart in hindsight. But it's a whole different story. This is all, as I said, can be incredibly frustrating. But I also like it a lot. I like this sort of idea that part of my job and maybe part of our collective job is to tell those stories and remember why we've made things a certain way. And sometimes maybe we could negotiate with them. There is part dependence, there is laziness, there are agreements. Sometimes we can push things forward, and sometimes at Figma we try to do it. And sometimes we won't, but at least we will understand them. right? And I like understanding those things. This is the original Macintosh. We talked about Command-Shift-1, Command-Shift-2. A few years later, Apple released Macintosh SE that had 2 floppy drives. That's easy. Put Command-Shift-1 at the bottom, Command-Shift-2 to eject the top one. But of course, you can connect an external floppy drive as well. And so what do? Command-Shift-3 is no longer available because we use it for shortcuts. So of course, they had to go somewhere else and they use Command-Shift-0, which actually kind of makes sense because 0 is far away from, so it kind of mnemonically makes sense, except then you start asking, why is 0 so far away? Why is 0 not before 1, which is ostensibly where you should put it? Well, because the first keyboard looked like this. And then for some reason lost to history, typewriters started adding 0 before they started adding 1, and they couldn't put 0 just in front of 2 because that looks ridiculous. So they put it after 9 because it looks like 10. And then by the time 1 was there, it was all over. Except on the Hungarian keyboard, which actually puts 0 on the left, which now I know. And I cannot not even unlearn this. And of course, at Figma, we have all of these shortcuts that are actually supposed to match visually what you do. And on a Hungarian keyboard, it looks like this now, and it's all broken. But at least we can fix it. And actually, I know how to fix it. It's my job to fix it. And it's kind of fun. Remember when I talked about faux superscript and real superscript? We did all we could to tell people, first we hid it, and then people complained. Then people said, we said, like, hey, the font doesn't have superscript. We cannot do anything about it. We don't want to do a fake superscript because it looks bad. We don't want to promote bad typography. But it's a hard thing to say to people if every other app has superscript that works for every font. So we added it. Earlier this year, we added it. And we decided, well, we just gonna do the best fake superscript in history. And we tried to do it. Right? We try to measure it accurately. We try to use the right symbols if the font had them. And the moment you use the wrong symbol, we would just go back to the synthesized version. But if you had a variable font with different weights, we would bump up the weight just a little bit so it felt better. Very proud of that moment. It works for a lot of fonts. This is Surveyor Text again, except there are fonts like Signy that go like little bold, little bolder, and then they go off the rails at the last moment. And so if you use that, so we literally have to. But it's okay, because we can. And that's the job. And that's the job. This is what it looks like today. We just sort of counteract. And that's the job because I really just want, with Figma and otherwise, for people to just be able to do their job and design, whether they have like a pretentious Helvetica or a very cheap one or a pirated one, if they use Windows or Chrome or Mac OS, if they use the worst keyboard ever made, or, the glorious clicky 1973 mechanical one, or some version of that we're trying to replicate. And even if they use chalkboard, because maybe they just like chalkboard a lot. Thank you so much. We have time? Thank you. I was thinking how I'm going to sit on this one for this whole day. And I never figured it out.
Well, there's no wrong answer. It's a chair. So it was a very fun talk. In fact, we can tell it was fun because we got some questions early on and then silence on the forum. Everybody was having too much fun actually watching.
Was the question, could this be more fun?
No. That's good.
Command B this talk in terms of humor.
No, I think it was bold enough. Yeah. So the questions we did get were about your style, though. Specifically, how'd you do these slides?
Oh, I think it's kind of like this. Like it's the same way we all do slides, at least as speakers here. It's regular. Look at my coding statements. I was testing some stuff. I was adding the big cursor that you've seen at the last minute. So I was testing it. So I don't know. It's just fun, right? I mean, that's like the creative way of using HTML and CSS, I guess.
Yeah, so it's all just custom stuff then?
Yeah, it's fun. I can share, I don't know if the code is the worst, right? It's definitely like a hot-wired prototype that will explode if you look at it funny. but I'm happy to share, and it's for me, it's always like a fun tool to aid storytelling, right? Because it's, Leah did it earlier, which was inspiring to me, is the sort of like, I don't have to type, the thing can type for me, right? So like, it's stuff like that. It's like, I can just make it hopefully a little bit more interesting or delightful or fun or informative, by using technology, but not drawing attention to it, right?
I think that sharing it would be good. We had a couple people explicitly ask for that. So, hey,
cool.
Throw it up on GitHub or something.
Sure. The fonts might not be licensed for sharing, but we figured it out.
Yeah. Related, right here on this slide, your highlighted area is all slanty.
Yeah.
Why you do that?
It's just kind of fun.
It's just fun and flirty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you noticed before, like when they were bolding themselves, they actually use variable fonts to go from regular to bold over like 200 milliseconds. So if you have a sharp eye, you probably noticed. Oh. And I would actually love apps to do that. I don't know Figma necessarily, because Figma is sort of like a professional tool, so it has to be very, very fast and sharp and snappy. But if you press Command B now, you could sort of imagine doing like a nice transition that just kind of makes people happy.
That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Well, on that, let's go ahead and end the day then. Thank you very much, Marcin.
Thank you.